Hey, good day, people. Hope everyone is well. I'm going to follow up a little bit on a comment that someone posted in one of my recent videos. A person said, "Will you say something about the origin and nature of Christianity?" Something like that. And I thought it would be a fun thing to talk a little bit about here. And I want to try to do it a couple of ways. One is to talk about different ways of understanding Christianity and maybe radically non-dogmatic ways, stuff aligned more to like the Gnostic Gospel of St. Thomas. Um, but okay, let's back up even further there. I think the simplest way to come at it, I think, from some perspective, is to get at the question of guilt and agency, and try to get at how the earliest people, as I guess evolutionary process was happening, and they found themselves caught with forms of self-awareness, forms of agency that were funded through memory and imagination, and the budgeting communicative practices of literacy that were you know already on top of thousands and thousands of years worth of language, right? So there was a sort of mythological, let's say, for lack of a better word, a kind of animistic, pantheistic, and then polytheistic, notions. And as you're drifting from animism to polytheism to monotheism, that's really a kind of sociological register of the crystallization and solidification of the ego in Western history. So they're like running concurrent. And the more that the individual crystallized into a detribalized, a center of self-conscious agency, trying to regulate itself through public, I guess the public domain, the origin of the public in ancient Greece, as opposed to tribal life, and some of those struggles in social organization that were happening as people were becoming more and more self-conscious. It was again, it was partly a transition over from earlier forms of animistic, polytheistic, naturalist forms of religion to a notion of monotheism. And notice that theodicy comes in here as a problem. That is, when you have many gods, the problem of evil doesn't really exist, because you can always account for the warring gods, or one god's more powerful than another, or you didn't pay attention to the right god and whatnot. But as soon as you have the notion of an all-powerful, all-loving God, then you get theodicy. You get to this whole problem of evil and why does evil exist and all this kind of stuff. Well, okay, so I think the way that I would want to come into the Jesus part of this, and by that I mean that's the Christian notion of the paradox, right? The infinite source of the universe actually manifesting itself as a finite living being who was born and then lived and died. Now, I myself would say this is a myth, and it's been grossly misunderstood. It's partly the problem of the transition from oral societies to literate societies. And one of the ways to really get at this is to get at the role of the snake. So if you take the snake, in ancient oral societies, the snake is a very important mythical creature. It's a creature that symbolizes life's ability to cast off death. It's caught in a cyclical time and perpetual renewal, so that the snake, it sheds its skin, and as it sheds its skin, it leaves the death behind. And so the Oberos, right, the Oberos myth, is the snake posed in a circle eating its tail. Now, it's not literally eating its tail. The snake is basically eating the dead skin that's being sloughed off, and that cyclical symbol, it represents the unity of life and death within oral cyclical time frameworks, mythical time, and that unity of life and death can be seen most clearly in that one phenomena we know as food. That is, food is where life and death unite. But what happens, right, as literacy, a certain kind of socio-historical consciousness is setting in. I guess larger bureaucracies, we could get at some of this, but it's that the snake increasingly becomes, I guess, it takes a negative role as we move toward linear time, and as the ego crystallizes in the individual, it's increasingly an issue of the individual's life journey taking on a spiritual significance. And the kind of spiritual significance ends up taking a bid for something like immortality, something like life after death, in a literal sense. Now, okay, I want to see if I can. So, well, part of it would be to get at the difference between the literalist notions of Christianity, the dogmatic, and I think the more robust spiritual, metaphorical one, the ones that people were trying to convey, I guess, in the ancient world when it was part of living psychology. And you could make the division between what could be called the doctrine of the immortality of the soul and the doctrine of life eternal. Now, the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, this is the notion that there is this rational soul substance that kind of came from on high. Like, again, there was a transcendent God out there, a creator separate from the created, and it gave you, I guess, it formed you into clay and then gave you this soul substance that you will have for your time here on this planet, but it's eventually going to go back home to somewhere else where it's going to be judged, and it's some kind of ultimate recompense and justice will be paid for how one obeyed one's conscience, given all the contingencies that one faced and this kind of stuff. And in some ways, it really does relate to Gnosticism, right? If people follow the roots of Gnosticism and the notion that there's a stardust that was trapped by an evil demiurge and it's waiting to get released back to its home. I mean, this is part of that influence in that particular doctrine. But I think the more robust doctrine, I think the one that's metaphorically true, and I think is what I would say the kind of Christianity that aligns sometimes with what people would call Christ consciousness and the degree to which someone has opened to Christ consciousness. Now, maybe this person, Jesus, the historical Jesus, was someone who had opened to Eastern philosophies. He had become more aware of those traditions where I guess the language was metaphorically referring to a different kind of rebirth, a different kind of awakening to a new possible self and a new world that comes from that new way of being. But this is, again, it must be called the doctrine of the life eternal. All right? Again, as opposed to the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, the sort of dogmatic, indefinitely ongoing soul substance, life eternal, something like this. Instead of the immortality of the soul, you go to this life eternal, and here the question isn't how does one prolong one's existence indefinitely into some, quotes, hereafter or to an afterlife. It's, when you're alive as an individual, that is, when you come into existence, you find yourself, and by the time you find yourself, you've always already begun. And on the other end, you'll be going, I'm dying, I'm dying, I'm dying. You won't ever get to I'm dead. If you get to I'm dead, you're not there. So life is eternal in the sense that it only knows itself from within itself. Somehow life has figured out a way to not have to experience its non-being on either end. It only opens such that it comes out of itself from within itself. But the task of the doctrine of the life eternal, of the person who's looking for a kind of Christ consciousness, it's how well can one open to the eternal in the now. That each moment, each now, has an open expanse, and it can be felt, I guess, with things like great amounts of love. It can come from artistic achievements, athletic accomplishments. It can come from a well-danced dance or a really great, engaging, interesting conversation. There's so many different ways where the eternal is it's a framework or a light that shines upon the present. it laminates it and opens it. And I think in some ways people talk about it as like the holy moment. You're trying to bring about a holy moment. It doesn't have to be an attempt to register some extra transcendent realm. There's a great line by Joseph Campbell. He says, to look for God is like riding atop a whale while fishing for minnows. There's a sense in which you are that which you're seeking to find, right? Thou art that, right? You are the manifestation of the original life force, and you don't need to look for it elsewhere. It's your very being is it's a localized manifestation. In some way, your body, your life, the situations that you're going through, they're very real in a very material sense, but on that metaphysical plane of the doctrine of life eternal, they're just on loan to you. You're moving through the odyssey of time, not so that you as ego can get somewhere else, but so that the you as mask being worn by the eternal can open to all of the wonders, the mysteries, the horrors, with courage, compassion, and love. And so, Christ consciousness is about learning how to disidentify with the ego and to joyfully participate in the sorrows and the injustices of humanity, to try to bring about as best you can. So let me see if I can back this up a little bit. I'm going to maybe end it with some Plato versus Nietzsche and how that relates to Jesus. But I think one of the things to think about is, in the ancient world, as you're looking at the Socrates, Plato, Aristotle development, there was a great concern in Plato about what justice is and how do we best understand justice and the good and the beautiful. And part of this is precipitated out of the ironic death of Socrates. And Plato, I think he wants to say, if you take things like the beautiful, the good, and the just, these are abstractions that have been funded out of literate thought, but out of a particular kind of thinking that was going on in the Greek world. But you were able to think about abstractions. And like you were saying, what is the beautiful? And he says, I don't mean this beautiful tree versus this beautiful mountain versus this beautiful painting. I mean the beautiful per se. That is the notion, the essence of the beautiful, arrested of all the independent beautiful things. And then he says that's the one that, even though it's abstract, we could agree upon the most. We have some sense of what that is. But if we move to what is the good or what is the just, it seemed so much harder. I mean, the good seems even more abstract than the beautiful because it's not directly caught in one sensory modality. I mean, I guess, there's beautiful music and beautiful paintings, so it gets multimodal. But the good just seems to be almost like a meta level on that. And then justice, it seems like it's almost abstractly weighing different kinds of goods. It seems arguably one of the most difficult and unanswerable, although I guess for Plato in some way he was more interested in what is meant by the good. Okay, so at any rate, what's interesting is that, so this is all happening well before Jesus. By the time Jesus hits the scene, the social inequality in the ancient world is massive. There's all kinds of, lending is huge. The Romans were one of the first empire to not end debt after 6 years. Social inequality is starting to, and bureaucracy is really crushing people out. And so Jesus hits the scene, and in some way, it's like there are three kinds of Jesuses, right? So there's three Jesuses. So there's one Jesus who is we'll call it the dogmatic, the super fantastical Jesus, who is the one and only Son of God, who is part of the Christian dogma, who had life, again, was of virgin birth, will have life after death and be the judge or redeemer, blah, blah, blah. Then there's this, I guess, very different Jesus who is what's like a social reformer, and he's there at the money table, and he's flipping over the monies and the lenders, and he's willing to sort of sacrifice the his own life for bringing about a better world there and sort of confronting it. And then, so again, you sort of have this fantastical Jesus, the social reformer, confrontational Jesus, and then the last one is this echo of reverberation against Judaic or traditional law, who says instead of vengeance and strength and courage and eye for an eye, it's turn the other cheek and forgive and compassion, Jesus. And see, so when you get these three, it's so interesting, because what happens as these bureaucracies occur, it's you learn that you can't fight City Hall, and that you can do everything right. You can be living a great life, but you can be living a great life, doing nothing wrong, and a huge bureaucracy can come in and impose really oppressive injustice. They can arrest you, take your family away, imprison your wife, your children, all this kind of stuff, and you can do very little. And if you're living in, I guess, that ancient ethical world that the earlier peoples were, with vengeance and eye for an eye, your hatred, the vitriolic, you just be eaten alive with a desire to retaliate against these people who so oppressed you. But the powers and the forces, so the actual oppression of the state will prevent it. And so you almost have to learn that message of Jesus in the turn the other cheek. So it's this huge psychological move that was setting in the problem of the crystallized ego in history. And the other one is the sort of dogmatic one. Now the middle Jesus, whatever happened to that Jesus, I think that's sort of Nietzsche's point. Nietzsche looks back, he says, in the wake of it, the only Jesuses who were left were this meek, turn the other cheek Jesus, who basically ended up becoming a kind of slave morality, or the super fantastical, the dogmatic, the person who most people, I guess, in today's modern world really question, or they just can't believe, right? But it's this middle Jesus, arguably, and by that I mean a Christ consciousness, that some of Nietzsche's work arguably could be looking for. That is, what would be the new vision? Who would be the new visionary? What would be the new vision of the person who could inspire an ethics or a moral age that would be robust? And it would place something like the aesthetic realization that all of us are dying, we're dying together, and how do we co-negotiate that in the most beautiful ways, in the least harmful ways, but also the most upbuilding and compassionate to all the injustices, trying to minimize it, but not at the cost of boredom and indifference. I mean, people have a need for robust meanings, and sometimes that comes through things like competition and through trial, through diligent work. So it's not about creating something like a paradise on earth. I don't think that's the end game. I think it's about learning how to open with a kind of gratitude and a compassion, recognizing that no matter what one ever has or does in one's life, no matter what one possesses personally as an ego, one is always already older and other than one thought. That is, you are a place and moment of life eternal, and you are the sunrise, you are the sunset, you are that. All right, thanks.